Hello. Today, I'm going to answer a single surprisingly complex question for you. What actually happened to Ben Shapiro? Back in the halcyon days of 2016, any enterprising young man like myself could log onto YouTube and, after maybe a couple intermediary gaming videos, get recommended a classic compilation of feminists getting destroyed by facts and logic that had his face smiling up from the thumbnail. Now, he's fallen off and you're getting recommended this video instead. When Ben was truly a big cultural name, I remember being constantly shown his content online and even in person, having friends of friends evangelize it to me during school lunches. Now, even though many of those people are still very right-wing, myself not included, they aren't watching Ben Shapiro anymore. This isn't just an anecdotal thing. By Ben Shapiro's publicly available analytics, it's pretty obvious that while other prominent right-wing content creators have used the Trump admin's non-stop news cycles to build popularity, his own subscribers have actually been declining for much of 2025. Talents that have explicitly aligned themselves against Shapiro's media group, the Daily Wire, such as its former employees Candace Owens and Brett Cooper, now rake in millions more views than he does, making culture war content that, on its surface, is very similar to Ben Shapiro's usual fare. While part of the problem is the Daily Wire's business model, which, while there are great videos that cover it in more depth, can basically be understood for our purposes as one step above shoveling money into a burn pit, Ben Shapiro himself has recently began underperforming his own in-house talents like Matt Walsh, who, despite still having lower views and subscribers on YouTube, is growing much quicker, being used as a figurehead for the Daily Wire more often, and occupying a far greater place in the right-wing ecosystem of other platforms like X. This shift hasn't stemmed from any real shakeup in Ben's own business style or content. Though he, like most of the broader right, doesn't do debates in the same way he used to, the overall tone and style of his content is largely the same, save for some inclusions of more juvenile reaction content and party games with the Daily Wire staff. Instead, I think Ben's fall-off is a consequence of changing cultural trends in the right-wing audiences whose attention he, and his conservative competition, are permanently vying for. While Ben was a fine voice for 2016's early MAGA movement, he just doesn't quite hit like the other conservative talking heads who have taken his place. A decade can really make a world of difference in a market as cutthroat and self-consuming as the conservative media sphere, and the change from then to now is crucial not only to understanding Ben's own downfall, but the disturbing transformation in American culture at large that led his conservative audience to toss him aside in favor of stronger stuff. First, to understand Ben's eventual fall, we need to understand a thing or two about his rise. And for that, we have to keep in mind that the vast majority of political media, especially infotainment content like Ben's punditry or even this video, is universally about emotion. While true information is still definitely good, the reason that people consume it and come back for more is typically because learning things and being informed makes a person feel better and more engaged with the world. The fundamental emotional mechanism here is the same as lower brow political rhetoric, which makes people feel angry or sad rather than more educated. That's why, in the sea of unseriousness, we were so lucky to have a voice like Ben Shapiro's, entirely focused on the facts and logic of politics, immune from the feeble little feelings that his facts didn't care about or whatever. The problem here is that Ben Shapiro was never actually interested in facts or logic. You can look to his complete and total malleability on right-wing anti-vaccine and anti-science narratives for this, or his neutered debate performance against more serious intellectual actors like Neil deGrasse Tyson. Shapiro generally stuck to debating partially hungover college students for a reason. Instead, Ben was interested primarily in weaponizing the general aesthetics of facts and logic, and the emotional logic that underlies them. And at this, he undeniably excelled. First, if you've ever actually seen Ben Shapiro debate, or even heard a minor snippet of his voice through some meme or another, you remember his voice. Here's an easy game. Think of a Fox News host or a right-wing content creator who you've seen once or twice, but who has a memorable face or said something. How well can you remember their voice, their inflection? How about their tone? The picture is probably a little muddy for someone like Michael Knowles, but for Ben, his voice is distinctive enough to essentially inspire its own genre of parody, in the form of those ironic, let's just say hypothetically, or destroying the left wing memes. Though I don't doubt that it's not entirely forced, Ben Shapiro's nasally, almost cartoonishly nerdy voice is a smaller part of an intentionally and performatively intellectual rhetorical affect. Beyond just the tone, Ben Shapiro also talks at a breakneck pace, which, while theoretically useful for delivering long or especially difficult concepts, typically far outruns the simplicity of his ideas. Instead, the speed of his speech serves to provide the aesthetic impression of someone with well-collected ideas and a lot to say, even when he's saying very little of actual substance. Now, take the fast-talking, nerdy affect alongside other parts of his performed identity. Back in 2016, when Ben was in the spry days of his early 30s, he constantly played up his young conservative persona, in part because of his youthful appearance, lack of facial hair, and constant collegiate tours. His performed identity was that of a sort of conservative young Shelton, an insightful pipsqueak firing off quick-witted and lexiconically dense destructions of liberal ideology from a collegiate podium. His ire was always directed at ideas, and the devastation he doled out onto his political opponents stayed exclusively in the realm of rhetorical humiliation. Ben spoke vanishingly little of actual violence, and always moved towards abstraction, like the classic, let's just say, hypothetically, tick, whenever he could. He was here to debate and cast any opposition to the marketplace of ideas he competed in as a totalitarian attack on his First Amendment freedoms, a fundamental threat to the free society he claimed to champion. This was the heyday of the Ben Shapiro character, a figure whose legacy still lives on today as an online mimetic representation of the 2016 to 2020 era of conservatism. The problem, of course, is that it's not 2020 anymore. Ben Shapiro is now in his 40s. He has, admittedly weak, facial hair. He stays away from debate and makes videos of himself reacting to woke TikToks instead. Back in his prime, the emotional narrative pushed onto the viewer when watching Ben dismantle a liberal argument was one of purely intellectual superiority. Ben was taking their prejudices, bigotries, or general vaguely held reactionary beliefs and rendering them as crystal-clear rhetorical traps. Suddenly, the conservative viewer's imagined figure of the college liberal, an emblematic effigy of all ivory tower left-wing politics, typically resplendent in their abstractions and sociological constructions, was being laid low by a young, upstart conservative armed only with his ideas. Ideas, which were typically cast as anti-intellectual or otherwise lacking in nuance, were suddenly not just reliant on general appeals to common sense or rural wisdom or base intuition, but could fit within an epistemological scaffold that allowed for feeling genuinely smarter than your political opponents. His arguments could, on their surface, appeal to logical and material analysis of the world rather than unchecked intuition. This is the real service that the Ben of 2016 provided his conservative audience. A way to make them feel smarter than people, not in spite of, but because of, their conservative views, without actually learning anything. Culturally, the popularity this bought him made sense. When Ben was just starting to take off, the Republican Party was fresh off of 8 years of being thrashed by Obama, whose talent at public speaking, college-educated tone, and, well, black skin, had ignited an increasing streak of intellectual inferiority in America's right wing. Ben was the balm on this fresh wound. When Trump came to power, his role as essentially the dumbest and most ridiculous person to ever hold the presidency made him ripe to be looked down on. Ben Shapiro provided the perfect intellectual inversion to this dynamic by casting Trump as someone with logical and evidence-based policy despite his personal belligerence. Now, in the year 2025, conservatives just don't need what Ben is selling. Trump is in his second term. The media corporations that once mocked his idiotic misspeakings now know to stay quiet or face reprisal. The brands whose pride-themed logos once provided Ben a quaint example of illogical liberal virtue signaling now toe the line. Conservatives don't need Ben Shapiro to humble liberal university students. Trump can take the fight directly to Columbia and use state power and funding for the same effect. As right-wing cultural dominance blooms at the corporate level and political level, the one truth teller in a world gone woke shtick that Ben once used to frame his arguments just doesn't stick anymore. This, of course, is borne out in the rhetoric of Ben Shapiro's ascendant colleagues like Matt Walsh. For example, after the Charlie Kirk shooting, the Daily Wire's biggest single contribution to the roiling attention economy was a video of him saying, in no uncertain terms, "Charlie tried to have conversations with you on the left, and you killed him for it. You're killing us in our churches. You tried to kill our president. You celebrate Charlie's death. It's time for good to fight back against evil." It's immediately recognizable in this quote that all the nasally abstraction once found in Ben's debates is entirely absent here. The language is as direct and as lurid as possible. Walsh has no need for nuance or appeals to facts and logic. There is an us, signified by him, Charlie Kirk, and the theoretical conservative reader, and a them that ropes in everyone from Trump's multiple Republican attempted assassins to random Twitter users celebrating Kirk's death, to the extremely and intentionally vague political left, which, hey, if you're watching this video in the eyes of Matt Walsh, you're more than likely a part of. Matt Walsh's us and them do not fight on a battleground of ideas, cleverly one-upping each other with carefully curated debate tactics from opposing podiums. They kill each other. And Walsh's us, that conservative reader, isn't here to feel smarter than the them. They're here to feel angry, fearful, and most importantly, existentially threatened. They are good, the enemy is evil, and the fight is now. Walsh's language is the language of blood. And while you may have seen his reaction, you almost certainly didn't see Ben Shapiro's own response to Charlie Kirk's death, which eked into Fox headlines with the two-word description "deeply terrifying," and landed on Twitter as an enormous paragraph which, well, actually quite heartfelt and personal in its eulogizing of a victim of political violence who obviously didn't deserve to die and did, in spite of all the harm he caused with racist podcasting, have an innocent family that Ben personally knew, but it still falls quite a bit flatter than Walsh's pithy, violent invective. A decade of Trump's increasing belligerence has rendered Ben's intellectual pretense comparatively puny. When you're in an existential war, you need a stiffer drink. If you believe you're fighting against enemies hell-bent on killing you rather than debating you, and you're waging that war with the help of the most powerful government apparatus in world history, you don't need to feel smarter than anyone. You can get away with feeling stronger instead. On another note, Ben Shapiro is also Jewish, and very, very supportive of Israel's right-wing government. Because conservatives so often land on a perfectly bizarro analysis of the world, until recently the first of those two traits got him more flack in inner-circle right-wing discourse. Now, even as anti-Semitism is also rising, public support for Israel is dropping even quicker, and many right-wing content creators without an ideological commitment to Israel have seen the writing on the wall. If you want to play at right-wing populism, as big GOP cranks like Marjorie Taylor Greene, Thomas Massie, and Tucker Carlson do, Zionism is decidedly less fashionable than it was when Trump was freshly springing from the wet egg of Bush-era neoconservatism. However, even before the Republican Party had internal debates about Zionism, it was having internal debates about Jews. Back in 2017, when the alt-right, as Ben Shapiro derogatorily aligned himself against, was a marginal force whose lack of cultural heft and mainstream visibility made it easy to separate from the rest of Trump's base, Ben Shapiro's Jewish identity and prominence served as an important bulwark against further influence from Nazis, and, perversely, a justification for their existence within the movement at all. Whenever a high-profile incident of right-wing anti-Semitism occurred, Ben Shapiro could step in, take the media spotlight, and explain that his existence as a high-profile Jewish conservative necessarily excluded anti-Semites from their movement. At the time, Ben Shapiro's rhetorical focus on debating college students and posturing about the free marketplace of ideas was also a gambit employed by other members of this same Nazi alt-right. Most notably, Richard Spencer and Milo Yiannopoulos used similar intellectual cover to advocate for out-and-out anti-Semitic white nationalism, which left Ben Shapiro in the uncomfortable position of having to condemn their positions, laud their tactics, and claim that the similarity between their theoretical structure didn't imply anything about himself or Trump's movement at large. This contradiction eventually came to its head when a white supremacist mob, inspired by the very alt-right rhetoric that embattled Ben, killed Heather Heyer at the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, which, despite drawing Ben Shapiro's immediate condemnation, led to Trump infamously declaring that there were very fine people on both sides. Here, in theory, was the perfect time for Ben to use his Jewish identity to provide cover to conservatives at large. He could say the quote was out of context and claim Trump handled Charlottesville perfectly, to walk away unscathed into the next news cycle with the relative approval of his alt-right coalition members, who still would probably not be super cool with the Jewish thing, but were having enough trouble optically downplaying Charlottesville that they would take the help. But this time, possibly in reaction to the pretty visceral experience of seeing a mob of people chanting, "Jews will not replace us," Ben did not play ball. Though Ben certainly didn't go as far as actually impugning the general right wing with accepting anti-Semitism, he attacked Trump in particular for the very fine people comment. That might overstate it a little. He said that Trump made a misplay by giving the left too much ammo, and barely moved to condemn the quote on its own merits, and did so in an article titled, "The Left Tries to Blame Trump for Charlottesville Terror, Here's Why They're Wrong." But still, this was at a time when the right-wing media was in a full-court press to whitewash Trump's comments. Even this mild breaking of lockstep was seen as an act of war. While Ben Shapiro had already been a long-time target of the alt-right, this take, in combination with his uncompromising Jewish identity, brought alt-righters like Lauren Southern directly down on him and his brand, and transformed the target painted onto his back into a mark carved into his skin. At this point, Ben largely learned his lesson. He deleted his original article and published a new op-ed whataboutisming Charlottesville's violence onto Antifa rioters who fought back against Unite the Right's white supremacist militias. And from then on, he toed the "media is lying about Trump's very fine people on both sides" comment whenever the issue came up, repeating the exact same talking points the alt-right had made for him. But the damage was still done, and the fissures this conflict, and again, Ben just being Jewish, had created are only more inflamed now that the alt-right has been normalized and folded into Ben's own immediate media circuit. We live in 2025. Nick Fuentes and Kanye West have visited the White House. Basically, all right-wing media figures are willing to entertain casual conspiracism about George Soros and his architecting of a Christian-killing New World Order. These are different times. Even within the Daily Wire, Candace Owens, who, as I mentioned earlier, has now far surpassed Shapiro's own popularity, split from him and the Daily Wire in general over what were, on the surface, disagreements about Israel's ongoing genocide. Now, she talks a little less about Palestinians and a little more about David Irving's theory of Holocaust denial. In fact, many of the very same Nazis she pals around with are the same alt-right influencers who Ben once went to war with. In this new media ecosystem, Ben's carefully cultivated image is a liability. The nerdy young conservative is of little use to Nazis when he also wears a kippah and evangelizes bombing Iran, and different young right-wingers like Nick Fuentes can also wear a suit and lack facial hair, though typically they do it while saying Jew very explicitly. While not everyone on the current populist right is a direct descendant of the Charlottesville-era alt-right, those who don't want to fully commit to anti-Semitism can comfortably dog-whistle to their more radical fans by performatively opposing Ben on Israel or economic populism, an issue where Ben Shapiro's ideological commitment to low taxes and low spending leave him at odds with conservatives who care more about a paternalistic fascist state that would help its white citizens with a welfare state than they do about free market capitalism. Tucker Carlson, who himself has only recently dipped his toe into doing interviews with Holocaust deniers, had already began to curry favor with Nazis years ago by attacking Ben Shapiro over his unwillingness to ban factory and trucking automation that would cause the uneducated white working class men who Tucker bases his politics around to lose their jobs. And make no mistake, this problem isn't going to get any better or easier for Ben. While the plurality of the Republican base is still very pro-Israel and largely captured by corporate interests who like Ben's free market policy, heavily engaged right-wingers whose politics are personally important enough to them to consume online content and engage in creator beefs are far more likely to be more radical and radically opposed to Ben's perceived moderation. And despite having less diehard support, Ben has very little room in the center either. Though Trump won the 2024 election off the back of uninformed, unengaged voters who saw him primarily as an economically populist and anti-war alternative to the Biden years, this new base is quickly slipping, and Ben's stuffy, economically conservative rhetoric is the opposite of the type that could actually claw them back. This is to say that whatever the future of the Trump admin looks like, Ben will always struggle to have a place within it. Any bridges he might have had within the bloodthirsty populist wing of the Republican Party were burned years ago, and the less ideologically motivated Republicans, who act more as a rabid fan cult of Trump's personality, aren't the type to engage with Ben's intellectual pretense. In fact, once I had already finished the script and was in the process of editing this video, Ben Shapiro made a bunch of headlines talking about how that script I was working on a couple of weeks ago was completely right about him and the cultural dynamics causing him to lose his audience, claiming that the conspiratorial right, which he himself had spent a decade helping to build, was way more mean to the one minority they were supposed to be cool with. Whether this was him trying to make some good grift fodder, or him genuinely confused how the face-eating leopard party might come after his face too, I have no idea. But I really struggle to believe that even Ben could think you get to target every marginalized group in society, except Jewish people, and go with every white nationalist conspiracy theory that isn't about Israel, was a sustainable state for the right-wing media sphere. That being said, as it stands, he clearly has some idea of just how quickly anti-Semitism is growing around him, and how effectively the very same algorithms that he once used to talk about the quaint threats of the New World Order and transgenderism have been turned against him. The right-wing audiences who moved on from Ben's low dosage of reactionary propaganda are now getting a far better fix of narrative insanity from their new generation of Nazi content creators, and no other part of the political spectrum has any real use for Ben. There is no off-ramp, and there will be no Ben Shapiro renaissance. This begets an obvious question. What will actually happen to Ben? The short answer is hopefully nothing major. While Ben's most vicious alt-right detractors do have a significant overlap with those mentally disturbed enough to attempt some form of high-profile violence, that sort of attack is extremely unlikely. It's more likely that Ben will continue to do what he's done for years now, be talked about less and less, and gradually bleed more and more of his support to his competition. A creator of his size, with his institutional connections to the right-wing media and his pre-existing bank of capital, is never going to completely disappear. Ben is always going to be able to keep the lights on. But he's going to keep withering, too, and the rhetorical style of debate bro, intellectually combative conservatism he brought will wither with him. While a portion of his fan base is captured enough by his foundational role in building the movement a decade ago that they're probably not going to leave anytime soon, any section of the right not already bought in won't be joining him either. Outside of a common hitting post for the right's more virulent anti-Semites, his role in their culture will flounder. Funnily enough, Ben Shapiro's mimetic aesthetic is living, and will live, far longer in the left-wing imagination than that of the right. As the right's more explicitly fascist rhetoric continues to heat up and calls for violence and the wholesale destruction of the democratic process become more common, take cold comfort in the fact that, for all the harm it does, that language is transforming the movement that Ben helped to build into a burial mound for the many causes he claimed to represent. Free speech, the free market, the Constitution, the Daily Wire, America as a whole, and of course, conservative support for Ben's beloved Israel are now all in the firing line of the very anti-Semitic mob he helped to birth. Anyway, here's that video of Zoe Tur, the transgender talking head, threatening to beat Ben up for misgendering her, in hopes of getting you to stay for the outro. If you've been here this long, clearly this video has been of some use to you. Subscribe to this channel and it can be of use to you again. In fact, you should like, subscribe, comment, and do all the various other algorithmically beneficial things you can do, so that it can be in use to other people, too. Thank you for your time.